Okay. Power situation. Okay, I'm not going to worry about it. Oh, I thought it was 50. Okay, we're going to get underway in just a second after I get the blue sheets started. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the extensions to. Hello, can you hear me? A little louder? Okay. I'll pretend I'm back at Penn State lecturing a lecture hall of 400 students. So, good afternoon, welcome to the Dnssd working group meeting. There's the note well. Note well. Exactly, he said. Okay. We have a Jabber volunteer already. We have 1 minute taker. We could use a second minute taker. Volunteers? Going once, going twice. Perhaps the Jabber scribe could add a little extra information into the Jabber room about what's going on. And I can extract from that information as well. Thank you.
Also, if you take notes into the Etherpad, then obviously anyone can chip in and help.
Ah, right. Yes, of course. Thank you. God, this new technology. Okay, right. Our info hasn't changed. And here are the statuses of our documents. Yeah, why don't you do that one?
So yeah, the three main documents we want to talk about today are the ones that are the adopted working group documents, two of which have had a working group last call in the last couple of weeks and a bit, and the other one we want to have a discussion about where we are, how advanced it is, and the next steps. We've also got a couple of personal drafts we want to discuss if time permits. Ralph and I have decided we would like to put the majority of the effort into the top three, and hopefully time will permit for a discussion on the bottom two. The bottom two are largely around the threats analysis document that's been ongoing for a while, but also Christian Huetema has kindly done a little suggestion for how he might consider privacy in these protocols. So he's put forward a draft on what we might do there, and we can discuss that. Christian's got a little bit of time to present it. So yeah, the main goals for this session, we've got 90 minutes. We want to review the working group last calls of both the hybrid proxy and the label interop drafts and decide what we want to do with DNS push, or rather how to progress it, I hope. Then we have the more established threats document that Doug and Husnier have been working on. plus the new document from Christian, and we need to think about how we take those forward. And also to tease apart perhaps any operational from protocol issues. Hopefully there aren't protocol issues that are arising from those, but if there are, we need to identify them and get them into the other documents. The agenda for today, the bulk of the time is for the discussion of the working group last calls and what we're doing at DNS Push. And then we've got a little bit of time at the end for the threat and privacy drafts and a little discussion of that. But Ralph and I are happy for the first part to overrun a little bit, and if it does, we'll prioritize Christian and take the discussion to the list. Okay, and without any further ado, we'll move on to the first talk, which is the hybrid proxy draft. Hopefully Stuart is over there and ready to come up. So we've got 25-30 minutes at least to discuss this. We have, oh, is that slightly updated? Oh, it's your remote, okay. He's hacking my machine. Okay. Okay, over to you, Stuart.
We had the working group last call. We've had comments from a bunch of people. I want to quickly summarize what the comments here. And if anybody thinks I've mischaracterized them or they disagree with them, come up to the microphone and speak. Otherwise, we don't need to spend a lot of time dwelling on this. We can save the time for other discussion. Tom Pusateri had a bunch of good editorial comments which will improve the document. He also pointed out a key observation, which is with DNSSEC, it's not possible to know authoritatively that something doesn't exist without asking to find out. And that is actually a theme that recurred in several of the comments, so it's worth me mentioning it now. A lot of people assume that multicast DNS has periodic announcements so that just by listening on the network, you know what's there. And it was actually designed not to do that because we didn't want it to be chatty. So if you run a packet sniffer on your home network overnight, you should see no announcements. In the absence of any queries, the devices offering services remain completely silent. So what that means is if you expect to find what's on the network by just passively listening, you're not going to find it. You only find out if something is there by positively asking for it. So if you want to print and you send out a query for printers, then the printers ought to respond. If there's some other service that you've never heard of and you don't have a client for that service and you never ask for that service, then it's kind of a phantom ghost service. It may be on your network in principle, but it's not going to announce that fact if nobody's looking for it. So the implication of that is if you were to try to gather up all this data and do a zone transfer to another DNS server, you can't say for certain something doesn't exist if you haven't asked for it. And that means you can't generate NSEC records to authoritatively declare that something doesn't exist. Tim also had a bunch of good editorial improvements and wanted some addition of discussion of how this scales to campus-sized networks. I think it does, but we need a paragraph that discusses that. Ray Hunter had a bunch of questions and observations. One is that when a service moves around, it looks like a new service on a new link. There is no concept of mobility for servers. Ray was concerned that multicast traffic storms might be caused by forwarding multicast packets. So I think the document should clarify that multicast packets are never forwarded. And I think to avoid, to help it be more understandable to readers, it would be worth putting a little ASCII art picture in that shows the communication that goes on. A remote client makes a TCP connection to a proxy that proxy does multicast requests on its behalf. It's analogous to me phoning you from across the country and saying, could you do me a favor? Could you do this browse for me and tell me what results you're seeing on the network? And then you tell me over the phone. So that's what the word proxy means. It's something acting on your behalf. Ted made a long list of comments. Thank you, Ted. One was to shorten the abstract, which we'll do. Ted, as others, was concerned about the need to name every link. And the document has one sentence referring to the fact that maybe we should have a mechanism for merging multiple multicast domains so that they appear logically as one. And it's starting to seem like we do need to do that because more than one person is asking about this issue and saying that having every link be named separately is a problem. If you believe that a home network will have 2 or 3 links maximum, it's not a problem. If you believe it may have 10 or 20, then it may be an issue. Ted asked a question about pushing updates using DNS update as opposed to it being a pull model, depending on the client asking. And that's what I was just discussing, that really that push model doesn't fit with multicast DNS. The idea of the proxy is you bring the client's queries to the local network rather than pushing the local network state somewhere else for the client to query, because until you know what the client's looking for, you don't know what it might be interested in. For good or bad, that is part of the design of multicast DNS to reduce the chattiness on the wire. Ted also had a suggestion for having the rich text name of a link be stored as ephemeral data rather than actually the domain name itself. And I'll need to think about that to work through how that would be implemented. Ted asked about how domain delegation is accomplished. And I think that was coming from a sort of HomeNet perspective of how would you do this automatically. In an enterprise scenario, the delegation is done by the network administrator deciding what's going to be delegating and deciding what the names are going to be. We could probably have a paragraph discussing that.
So I think, sorry, Stuart. First of all, if anyone's got any questions, please do come to the mic while we're discussing it rather than waiting to the end. The second one there is a draft that Marcus, he's probably in the Babel BOF, I would guess. Is Marcus here? No, he's probably in the Babel BOF. So he's got a draft on the operation of this type of technology in the HomeNet context, which is waiting on this to progress, I think. Sorry, go on.
Thanks, Tim. We should have some discussion of ULAs and when they're forwarded off link. A question I'd like to ask the room, see if there's any sense, is Ted asked the question, why not just use a TTL of 0 for everything? And effectively that makes all the responses non-cacheable. There might be some performance implication of that. We have seen potentially badly written clients that will do the same query 5 times, and a little bit of caching will help suppress that. An example may be web browsers. If there's a bunch of images that all have the same host name in them, then a simple-minded piece of code is going to look at that same host name 5 times. And if there's local caching on the device, then that is fairly benign. If there isn't, that results in 5 queries on the wire. And then you might ask, well, why doesn't the web browser do its own caching? And the answer is because the web browser doesn't have access to the TTL, so it doesn't know how long to cache it. So there's an argument that having that caching be a system function, not an application function, makes sense. Ted?
So actually, I think you might have misunderstood that comment. I wasn't suggesting that clients should assume the TTL is 0. What I was suggesting is that if you're using the DNS protocol as opposed to the MDNS protocol, that you could send a TTL of 0 because you don't care as much with DNS because it's unicast, so you're not multicasting a gajillion requests, and if you happen to repeat the same request 5 times, it's really not that big a deal. you're just using it. It's you know, we've used NFS on our networks. Compared to that, this is nothing.
Okay, that's a fair point. There was a question about allowing resolution of .local names on other links, which I don't know how to do, because by its nature, .local means a local multicast. So I don't know how you would indicate which remote link you wanted to do the .local on.
So the idea there is that if you have, this is Ted Lemon again, if you have a scope of, you know, so essentially Dnssd is looking into having a scope for DNS service discovery, for automatic DNS service discovery that's larger than a single link, right? And so one way to approach that would be to say, well, you know, if something does an MDNS lookup for a particular name on the, using just plain old MDNS, that you will give it answers that you know about that are not on the local link, but would be considered to be local to that link, nevertheless, even though they're on a separate link. You see what I'm saying?
I think you're seeing this through the HomeNet lens again.
Well, so specifically what I'm getting at, and actually this may be irrelevant because we actually had a conversation about this when we were talking the other day, that basically all clients we're aware of will do DNS lookups as opposed to MDNS lookups, and hence there's no real reason to be concerned about making sure that MDNS reveals things other than local stuff.
Okay.
So
if
that's
that
actually
discussion resolved that, then that's good.
Yeah.
One question Ted asked at the high level is, do we need change notifications at all? What's wrong with polling? Which I suppose is a valid question. Okay, Ted's looking puzzled. Maybe that's not what you meant either. Okay, well, we can take that offline. Maybe I misinterpreted your email. And Ted made a good point that this reiterates the zone apex discovery algorithm from the LLQ draft and the push draft, and that's probably redundant. I think I put it in initially to explain the concept because people are asking about it, but at this stage it doesn't need to be replicated. Ted also made the good observation that the SOA serial number should increment every time any change to the zone is discovered. Marcus had a bunch of comments too. One of Marcus's questions was whether there might be excessive multicast traffic with lots of clients querying. And the answer to that is the proxy on the local link will have an up-to-date cache of what's on that link. And if it gets 5 remote queries for the same data, it doesn't have to do 5 multicast queries locally. It can do duplicate query suppression. And in fact, the current Bonjour code that Apple has, and I expect others too, already has that duplicate query suppression. If you open 5 terminal windows and do a query in one of them, you'll see in TCP dump, but the packets go out. If you then do the same query 4 more times, there are no more packets because the machine is already doing that query. It already has the answer. It doesn't have to do it again. The proxy on the local link has that benefit of being physically on the link and having a cache up to date. Its 5 clients might be in 5 different parts of the world where they don't have that cache up to date. So funneling all of those queries through the one device that does have an up-to-date cache gives you that benefit of caching, which is really why this mechanism is not about forwarding queries onto the local link. It's about answering queries based on the information that that device has. So it's not a one-for-one query forwarding mechanism. It's more akin to a query into a database. Marcus asked the question about whether we want to be capping TTLs. The document right now specifies a maximum of 10 seconds to avoid stale data. Marcus raised the question, do we need that? If the client has stale data in the cache, it'll know that when it fails to connect over TCP. So I was raising the question to see if anybody felt strongly about it. It doesn't seem like anybody does. So that's okay. You can comment on the list if you change your mind later. One of the comments Marcus said is the document explicitly doesn't discuss the thing that some other people have proposed, which is rather than having this thing be driven on demand by client queries, to have it be more active and be actively pushing data up to some secondary name server in case a client wants to query it. I think that's true. That's a fair statement about the document. It doesn't describe that not because that wouldn't work, but because that's a different mechanism. The idea of this mechanism is it does discovery on demand in response to client interest. So the whole mechanism here is you don't push data into the cloud, you bring the queries to you, and then you respond to those queries. So that's the focus of this document, and I think it would be valid to have other documents that describe other ways of doing it, but that would be a different approach to this. And Marcus reiterated that in the home with lots of links, having them appear as separate links might be confusing. Merging them would be better. Ted.
So we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and one of the things that seemed like it's Ted Lemon. One of the things that seemed like it was a maybe almost conclusion of that conversation, we were a little rushed, was that if you have a service that's publishing its stuff in DNS using DNS updates, then this problem isn't very hard. And we talked about a mechanism for disambiguating, and that would be something to do in the future. I'm a little concerned about doing link merging. And then actually, yeah, we also talked about doing link merging by just noticing DNS announcements and keeping track of them, and then if something else on another wire announces the same name, defending that name, and at that point now both devices have different names, and so there's no problem merging. The namespace is at least in principle disjoint. So I think that would be a good approach to use if we decided to do that.
The reason I haven't written a document about merging links yet is because the idea is not fully formed in my head. Okay. It's starting to sound like I need to sit down and think about that and work out the details.
Yep. Let me know if you want to cooperate on that.
Thanks.
Dave Taylor. So I agree, Stuart, with your answer on the relationship to DNS update, but what Ted made me realize is it actually may be worth having a sentence that says that the zones that you're using to proxy should not be any zones that you're using with DNS update. Right. The example that he gave is if I have a device that's actually both exposing itself on MDNS and has permission to put itself in the regular DNS with DNS update, it shouldn't be putting into the same zone as the proxy is using, right? There should be two different ones. Just having a sentence that says that would be useful.
That's right.
Yeah, so I agree that it shouldn't be in this document mechanism, but that sentence would actually be useful to say that, by the way, these zones here are not ones that are enabled for DNS update.
That's right. The zone that is being served by this device is exclusively created by multicast queries. There is no other way to get data into it.
So I think the draft as it is talks enough about the trade-off between this mechanism and DNS updates and the pros and cons. So
the other thing I think it maybe ought to mention more explicitly is this draft is a pragmatic reaction to the state of the world that we find it in now in 2016. In the past, I thought that DNS update was a viable direction, and I kind of had this fantasy that future printers will all have DNS update clients in them, and that turned out not to happen. What did happen is that virtually every printer made, certainly every consumer printer, supports AirPrint, which means it supports multicast DNS service discovery. I I recently bought some home electronic stuff. My Sony amplifier advertises the web page via MDNS. My Yamaha amplifier does. I bought a little energy monitoring gateway that talks via Zigbee to the electricity meter, and that exports a web page that's advertised. So I'm starting to discover all of these devices that, without any involvement from me, are advertising their services using multicast DNS, which is kind of rewarding to see it taking off after many years of trying. What none of them are doing is DNS update. So we find ourselves in this world where actually quite a lot of modern devices on the home network will answer multicast DNS queries. And then the question is, how can we use that and leverage it to give us broader discovery rather than proposing something they don't do and may never do?
Yeah. I mean, this is obviously, this is Ted Lemon again. I walked up to the mic again because when Dave said what he said, that immediately flipped the bit in my head saying this is not the right solution for HomeNet. But what you just said says tough shit. Oh, sorry, tough luck. Because you know, we have to deal with the devices that we have, and so.
Well, I wouldn't say have to. There's an opportunity there.
Mm-hmm.
There's information that's available on the network, and if we can take advantage of that, we can maybe do something useful.
I mean, we have to deal with the devices that we have simply because we want it to work. So we don't really have a choice there. I would really like to have a very clear document that explains how devices can do a secure registration on the net, like we talked about the other day, basically where they publish a key on every name, and then that can be used to defend the name later. I think if you say that the names that you acquire using MDNS can't be published in a zone that is shared with zone transfers, then essentially the thing that I described in the HomeNet draft can't happen until all of the legacy devices are gone, which could be anywhere from 10 to infinity years.
Well, there is a different approach, which is if you didn't want to discover everything on the network, you could have a whitelist of known service types and then have your proxy device explicitly query for the things you care about and package that up into a zone which it can zone transfer to a secondary. So it's not to say it's impossible, but it would be a slightly different solution. And it might have some limitations, and it might result in more traffic, but that's not to say it's not possible.
Dave Taylor, I can't tell whether I misinterpreted what you said or not, but you can have the same first label in different zones, and we're not talking about that. It's whether the domain suffix is the same. And so you might be printer1 or printer space 1 or whatever it is, but in the MDNS, it's .local, and in the proxied version, it would be .building1.example.com with some other stuff in between those two, right? And if you had that be in DNS update, then it would be printer1 something else, but it's still printer1. So the first label can be shared. That's not the problem, right?
Ted Lemon again. So just to basically. The problem that I have with what you just said is that I don't see any value at all to that intermediate zone. The zone that is well, let me put it a different way. So having multiple zones where the same name might appear is a UI disaster. It is a tremendously bad idea. We do not want that, right? That would suck. And so things that we might wind up doing here to make our lives easier that bring about that result are the wrong thing to do. If in fact what we really need to do is have a zone that can't be zone transferred, and that's the end of the story, then that's the end of the story. And probably I should just update the HomeNet architecture to take that into account. I don't think that's the right answer.
Do you have a response, Stuart? Now I understand what he was saying.
I don't have anything more to add on that.
All right. I believe what you're suggesting, that the translation that would be Right. You have the authoritative server for the local zone, which is the hybrid proxy here. Okay. You're saying if you do DNS update, okay, then you should be doing DNS update to that particular authoritative server within the same zone. And if that hybrid proxy chooses to be a DNS update server over DNS and a hybrid proxy and follow both rules and that has some merging logic, that is fine as a way to write a draft that says here's how you can do that. And you're suggesting that we not preclude that. I heard a volunteer to write a document.
Yes.
Right. But the point is, it should be, there's only one authoritative server, the set of authoritative servers for a zone. You don't want two competing ones, right? If you're going to have two different mechanisms for updating it, it better go to the same.
I think that could be made to work, and I'm happy to sit down and chat with you about the details.
Okay, that sounds good. Onwards.
Ralph had some questions about exactly how the caching works, which I explained a little bit verbally today about having multiple queries running. I'll add some text to the document that describes that. Ralph was specifically asking about the sentence in the document that says that caching can be used to suppress unnecessary queries. And I will expand on that. The details there is, if this is a one-shot query for, say, the address records, when the query comes in, if the records are in the cache, then that's the answer, and there is no need for any multicast queries on the wire because you already have the answers. So in that case, it completely suppresses multicast queries. If it's a long-lived ongoing query, like browsing for printers, then the mechanism is slightly different, but still suppresses unnecessary traffic on the local network. When the query comes in, if there are answers in the cache, those answers go back immediately, but there might be additional things we don't know about. Just because we found two printers, we might not have found the third one, which is the one we're actually looking for. So because of that, the client will then issue a multicast query, but in that query, there's a known answer list, which serves to suppress unnecessary responses. And in effect, that's saying on the network, I've heard about you and I've heard about you. Are there any other printers I don't know about? So that does generate a query on the wire, but it suppresses the unnecessary duplicate answers. So I will add some text explaining that. Dave read it very thoroughly and pointed out a bunch of little nits which nobody else did, so thank you, Dave. Dave asked the question about, can you have multiple hybrid proxies? And I think the answer is yes, so we can add some text about that. Dave asked the interesting question that if a query comes in for a Punicode name, should that be translated to UTF-8? And the short answer is I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that. And also a request for something explicit about denial of service vulnerabilities and what the properties of those are.
Yeah, so I was just going to say the same thing at the mic for remote people. This is Dave Taylor. I suspect that the answer is yes on the Punicode one, because you got a request coming in for xn -- chicken scratch, and either you're going to drop it, return a failure, or actually potentially return something interesting. And out of those, the principle of least surprise would probably argue for the third one, which is return something that would be better than nothing, which is don't just drop it. Because the problem is the courier is a unicast DNS courier, and he may not have great knowledge of whether he expects the record in the zone to be in UTF-8 versus something else, and so by default he's going to just come put Punicode into there. And so I think the answer is yes, you should. And so I guess that would be my straw man proposal.
Sounds reasonable. And that is the end of the comments on the list. So if sounds like Ralph has a comment. And then
So I think we've had, it's good that we've seen 7 or 8 people who have clearly given the document a good read and made comments on it. I think we need to decide what we're going to do with the next steps. Clearly, Stuart has some updates, no pun intended, to do to the document. And then we need to decide whether that can progress or whether we need to repeat the working group last call to make sure that those have been captured as the commenters wished. Ralph.
Thank you. Ralph Drums, hat off. Just a quick question. I realized I didn't catch your answer. The noise pollution there in the corner is horrible, and it's very hard for me to hear what's going on. You mentioned EULAs. I don't recall what the context and what the answer was, and it also brings to mind what is the impact of link scoped addresses, and how, do they require special treatment or what?
I think it already says that link scoped addresses are automatically excluded.
Okay.
Because pretty much by definition, they're not going to be usable.
Right.
For the case of EULAs, I'm not sure how to do that without configuration, because the focus of this document, in my mind, is the enterprise case. I hope it's also useful in the HomeNet case, but really the focus is an enterprise network where it is configured by a competent administrator. They decide what the subnet layout is going to be. I've been involved with some of the planning for the new Apple campus flying saucer building, and believe me, it's not self-configuring. There's many hours of meetings and many people drawing pictures on whiteboards about how everything's going to be laid out. So a lot of thought goes into the network topology, where the access points are, where the different v6 prefixes live. So in that environment, you could have an entire enterprise where this mechanism is intended for use entirely within the firewall. It's not intended for internet-wide use. And within the firewall, your ULAs are entirely routable within the organization. So any device anywhere with a ULA address is actually reachable from anywhere else inside the organization. And because of that, having a single rule in the specification about what you do with those, it kind of depends on knowing whether the address will be usable to the client.
Right.
And I'm not sure a single answer for that.
There's probably not. There's also a somewhat more perverse case where you could have, you can have multiple nested EULAs where some EULAs have a scope that's less than the entire enterprise, and I call it a perverse case explicitly because I don't think you want to bother trying to address it in this document.
Yes, I mean, IPv6 used to have site local addresses, and they kind of morphed into EULAs for a good reason, and I think people are still kind of unclear about how to handle them.
So on the topic of EULAs and the HomeNet, one of the things that I don't recall if it was in our conversation or some other conversation I had yesterday, but one of the things that came up is that you really actually kind of want to have all of the hosts on the HomeNet use EULAs because you can't depend on your upstream address being stable. And so in point of fact, you probably want the hybrid proxy when it's being queried from on the HomeNet to answer only with EULAs and not with any public addresses, because on the HomeNet at least, EULAs should always be reachable within the whole HomeNet.
Right.
So there doesn't really need to be a configuration parameter there. Tim?
Just Ralph and I had a little meeting this morning discussing how the jobs are going. One of the things that we talked about was, as Stuart says, the focus has kind of been on the enterprise or campus.
Yeah.
One of the things we could do, protocol aside, is then produce an operational, informational best practice document that says, in these different contexts, this is how you use this technology.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
that would then not hold this up while we push.
Yeah, no,
this through.
I'm not suggesting that you need to fix this in this document.
But I think that's a document we
Yeah.
need, the operational.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually probably the HomeNet MDNS hybrid document, which is may even be a standards track document because it may need to define some new behavior. But yeah.
Well, one of the things that became evident to me in discussions is this hybrid proxy is a building block.
Yeah.
It is not the entire solution. To use hybrid proxy in HomeNet, there needs to be some additional mechanism that specifies how it's configured when there isn't the enterprise administrator to make those decisions. And this document does not specify the auto configuration because this is Dnssd, not HomeNet. So
Right.
that's why there's that gap in the document.
So when we talked about the requirements at the start, I think there were 5 use cases Enterprise stroke Campus was one, HomeNet was one, I think Zigbee, Mesh Networks might have been one, and there was a couple of others. So I think exactly as Stuart says, this is a building block, and then we may or may not move on to produce the sort of operational, how you configure, how you make the privacy considerations correct, etc. Those documents to follow.
Sounds like violent agreement.
So I think the next step is, regardless of what the next step is, Stuart can make the edits, publish a 04. Rolf and I will speak to the AD, Terry, and we'll discuss whether we need to repeat the working group last call or whether we can progress it in the meantime. So thank you very much. Stuart, the next talk is on DNS push. So we're going to hear where we are with the updates on that. So we're up to 07. Oh, okay. Thought we were at 06. Okay, 07. Things are moving fast in this working group.
Yeah.
Over to...
Yeah, 8 will be out any minute now, but 7 came out an hour ago. Excuse me. Okay, go ahead. Okay, I'm not going to go over every one of these things so we can save time for discussion of the open issues, but all of these are pretty self-explanatory. In 6, I'll mention 2 of these. The first one is during implementation, somebody asked if we should support DNS update on that same server. We just had a discussion about that, and here we said it's optional because we didn't want it to be mandatory, but there probably needs to be more clarification at this point. So, second, standard DNS queries can come in, and you should respond to them if they're within the zone. If they're not, then you should return not authoritative. So other things are pretty self-explanatory there. Okay, 7, which just came out an hour ago. These are the changes that are in there. It's just a clarification that any really means any record. Let's see, in the request, the ID was 0, and there was, during implementation, some issues with, it would be easier if that ID was we could look that up in a response, and so it now says that the responses must echo back what was in the request, and so if the client issues it with an identifier, then the server will send it back. If not, whatever's there. So it's kind of optional. And then as far as closing the connection, there's an update saying that a client, it could have a connection open and not have any subscriptions, and could keep sending idle keep alives. And so the connection could just be open forever. It's really up to the server at that point whether he wants to close it. So, and if an error is returned, it's probably going to be that it's the wrong server. You're not authoritative for the request, and so you shouldn't close the connection because you get an error response back. Okay, so these are the kind of 5 discussion points that we wanted to talk about, and I'll just go through them one at a time, and if you come to the mic if you want to discuss them. Okay, on the subscribe request, the current document says that it's implicit that there's a keep alive there. This saves a little bit of space, but you have to treat it differently. So, we could go either way on this. If we think there's a good reason to put an explicit keep alive in the request, we can mandate that.
Ted Lemon. I personally, my philosophy, which I don't know that the working group necessarily agrees with, is that you should always not have special cases. So therefore, you should always send the keep alive option if you want to be kept alive.
Okay. So there's one opinion, one strong opinion. Well, if you think about this some more and want to send comments to the list, we'd appreciate that. Okay, then the current Keep Alive spec says in the response that every response should include the Keep Alive option with the timeout. And again, if you want to optimize it, we don't necessarily have to include that, since we're not trying to work in backward compatibility mode with servers that exist. These will be new servers that are created. We have a little more flexibility, but again, it's kind of the same thing. It could be an option, or it doesn't have to be. Okay, in the current Keep Alive spec, it doesn't really say how do we keep it alive, and so I guess that's left up to the each individual case, and so it could be TCP based or it could be DNS based, and if it's TCP based, then you need indications that the client has quit sending Keep Alives, and the server can tell that happened. If it's DNS based, then we have a couple of options, ways to do it. We could send the query with no questions in it, just so it receives something. We could send a subscription with no question. I don't know what an empty DNS message is. Maybe no question at all, I guess. I don't know how that's different from no question. But.
Two zeros, that would kind of mean no message, but it would
Okay.
be 2 bytes at the TCP layer to let the server know you're still there.
Right. Okay.
I hope we get somebody to come to the microphone to express an opinion for at least one of these, because otherwise we'll just pick one at random.
Don't be shy, you can come forward.
Ted Lemon, who always has an opinion. Yeah, so I think TCP Keep Alives are, the OS API question kind of kills it. I think that the empty DNS message, if it doesn't cause DNS servers to blow up, is probably the cheapest and simplest way to do it. But I'm not exactly an expert. That's just my sort of, having read the document, that was the one that looked most easy for me to implement.
Okay. Thanks.
Actually, I think this
Can
is
you-
Bertie Volts, and I think that you may want to consider a bidirectional. So you want to send something from the client that solicits response from the server if you can, because that assures the connection is truly alive. Because if you send it one way, if the server is down, is physically, the system is down, you're just going to end up with timeouts, TCP timeouts, and that can last a long time. So it might be better to think about something that actually is a query that gives you a response. Because all you're telling here is that you're trying to tell the server the client's up, but the client doesn't know that the server's up, right?
No, but it will get an indication on the socket.
No, it won't. Until the TCP retries and times out, it won't get any indication. So you can get, what's that? So it just depends on what timeouts you're trying to control here. A bidirectional would be the best.
I'm Andrew Sullivan. I'm not sure that we want to reinvent the stuff that the DNSOP just published on this very topic, but I'm not sure that the bidirectional approach is going to work. Can I suggest, though, since Stuart also asked that somebody say something at the mic, I think that this is something that actually needs a long investigation on the list, because it feels to me like there's there's some potential for some sharp edges here, and I want to have like all of the documents open in front of me when I do that, and I know I haven't done that yet. So I don't know if anybody else is in that boat, but that's where I feel like I am.
Before you sit down, Andrew, you said we shouldn't reinvent what DNSOP has just done, and I 100% agree with that. But I'm not clear on what DNSOP has just done, because the TCP Keep Alive thing that's in Auth 48 right now doesn't actually say a single thing about keeping a connection alive. It might be better titled DNS Time to Die, because it tells you when the connection will die. It doesn't tell you how you stop it dying.
Right. So this is Andrew again. That's the reason that I got up. So the original, the history of this idea floated around a few times, and the problem is, right, that you've got different kinds of mechanisms, but one of the big problems is you don't want the server to have a whole lot of state. And historically, the way this had to work was the client was supposed to, nominally in the protocol, right, the client's supposed to tear the thing down, but we don't like that. Because then the server is supposed to just sit there forever, and it's obvious denial of service. So the idea was that you negotiate this thing and you warn, I'm going to rip this thing down when this happens. So I think that that's part of the reason that it doesn't actually specify it, and it seems to me that under those circumstances you've got to do something else. The idea was that the server is sort of promising you that it's not going to do something before such and thus time, and so what you need to do at that point is sort of send another query of some kind. Yeah, you could send a short query, but I'm really nervous about that, about the 0 octet query, because it just feels that seems to me to be a sharp edge, and that's the reason that I'd want to really, have all of 10, 34, and 35 open, because there's so many buried bodies in there that it'd be good to maybe really do a careful job on it. But I'm not prepared to do it right now, but maybe in a week or two.
This is Shane Kerr. So I admit I haven't read this, but what's the strong motivation for insisting that the sessions stay open? I guess I don't understand the cost of it being torn down.
The entire reason for this mechanism is to avoid polling. So it's to replicate what currently exists on the local network with multicast, but over a wider area. So on the local network, if on my iPad, I press the print button and the printer's not there, and I realize that's because somebody turned it off, I walk over to the printer and I turn it on, and I come back and, oh, it's there now. Because when the printer powered up, it announced its presence because it realized somebody might be listening, and then the UI updates. If I'm doing that remotely to some other network, which might be topologically remote, it might actually be just upstairs in the same house, it might not be that far away, then I realize the printer's turned off, I go and turn it on. Somehow that UI has got to be told, you were looking for printers and I found 3. Oh no, wait, I found 4, another one just appeared. And we either do that by polling at some interval, or we do it by the client telling the entity it's talking to, this is what I'm looking for until further notice, keep telling me about changes, and when the user closes that UI, it says, okay, I'm done now, and it closes the connection. So the idea is that it's a long-lived connection with these asynchronous notifications.
But it sounds like the Keep Alive is kind of replacing polling by sending packets periodically. Is it just a cheaper way to poll? Is that the idea?
No. Okay, this is Dave Taylor. The difference is that if you're polling, you only get the answer right after you've sent the poll. And here the point is to get it any time in between when you sent the last poll and when you ever send the next Keep Alive, which may be a long time afterwards, and you want to get the response as soon as possible. They may not have been there at the time that you did the first poll. Right? It comes in 1 second afterwards. You don't want to wait around for 30 seconds or whatever your polling period is to get it to show up in UI.
In order to get reasonable UI responsiveness, you'd want to poll probably every 5 seconds because people are not that patient. Or even smaller, yeah, Dave says. The Keep Alive is really to let the server garbage collect stale state. That if I walk away and drop off the Wi-Fi network and never close the connection, TCP will let that connection persist indefinitely. And until the server actually tries to send some data and has a timeout, that connection could still be there 6 weeks later. So we want to detect when the client has wandered off and do some cleanup.
So this is Dave Taylor. I got up because I finally have an opinion on this slide, but only at the top level, meaning that the top level split is TCP layer versus DNS layer, and then within that there's a bunch of sub-layer ones. So I think I have a strong preference for DNS layer and not TCP layer. And among the DNS layer ones, I don't care which one it is as long as it's not a brand new message, right? Just reusing one of the existing ones the DNS server would reply to. And I think the reason for that is probably twofold. One is if the DNS server itself has some timeout that says, I haven't seen anything, that TCP layer keep labs won't necessarily get up to that, right? And so that's one. And then probably another one that hopefully won't occur, but those things we don't want to occur do end up occurring some places. If you actually have a TCP proxy in between you and the TCP server, it means the TCP keep labs may not get to the DNS server. And so it's more robust to have it be, end to end, if you will. And so that argues for DNS layer. And again, I don't care which one, as long as it's an existing DNS message.
You can tell it's a good discussion.
Wes Herdiker, Parsons. I don't, it's interesting. So if you sent a polling message every 5 seconds, right, that doesn't prevent you from actually receiving the response that you wanted at 2.5 seconds, at some random time, right? Just so a polling is a form of keep alive in itself. There's no reason why you have to do, a special case necessarily, unless it's expensive to respond to the poll. So the reality is that a DNS query containing 0 questions seems like we're creating an odd case, which might require special code in the name server in order to respond to it or to deal with it. When the reality is, if you just send a normal query, there's no magic code that has to change on the server side already. If you sent a normal query for something that we know, is already normal, like the roots SOA, for example, which is a very minimal byte question, the name server is not going to be stressed by handling, a simple query like that. Or, I would make the polls cheap and easy to implement too, in terms of response. So you can send back, no, I only have 3, and then 2.5 seconds later, you can still get another response that says, no, actually, I just found the 4th one.
Okay, we'll cut the line at Ted there, since we do need to.
Ted Lemon. So completely out of left field suggestion is to have the server send the keep alive, or just have the server send something, because that will cause the TCP connection to die if the client isn't there. And that really solves the problem. Doesn't matter. 90 seconds, there's no data transiting that line anyway. Bernie was saying that it would take a long time to die. But yeah, so the point is that that way the server doesn't have to do any special work. It just sends something out to the client, which knows to expect it because it is definitely one of these clients. And so there's just no concern that you're going to have to do extra work or anything like that.
And this is a special keep alive message or something?
Well, it could either be a message. I would say it would probably just be an empty DNS message, like you suggested, going the other direction, because we can tell the client that it has to support that message in this draft, and because the client is implementing that draft, presumably we can assume that it does support it, and then we don't have to worry about it being a sharp edge.
Okay. There's kind of open-ended questions in the draft about how to close the connection on the client side versus the server side. On the client side, if you do, it could do a reset and just drop all of its subscriptions. On the server side, if it's sending a terminate or send, something like that, then it really needs to send a fin to make sure that that data gets flushed out. So if anyone has a preference on that, we'd like to hear it.
So Bernie Volz. So I had commented to Stuart about this offline, and that is that, there's not really a problem in sort of identifying that this problem exists and stuff. But I think the text was too heavily on, you got to send an RST instead of just closing the connection. And I think that's the problem, is most, a lot of the socket interfaces and stuff like that don't necessarily give you that control. Okay. And so, I don't think we want clients to have to implement TCP over again or try to get into the stack somehow. So I think it's a and this is a well-known issue in the web world, and I was trying to look and see were there any, there's a lot of papers on it, and there was like an expired internet draft on the topic. I don't think it ever, I'm not sure what happened to it. I didn't chase it down. So I don't know, I don't have a good answer for you as to what to maybe refer to or whatever, but I think it's a well-known problem in the web space, and I don't know exactly how they recommend solving it. But I would try to keep the clients out of having to need to send RSTs.
Yeah.
I think they should close the connections, and if you can abort the connection, that's great because it avoids this problem. But I would just leave it as an advisor, as advice, not a requirement or whatever.
Okay, thanks. So maybe we should change it just to say that that the client doesn't have to flush its buffers, but the server does. Okay, this issue is currently in an unsubscribe and a reconfirm. When the server receives that, it doesn't send back responses. It's not clear if that's needed, and we think that maybe a future version might decide to do something different. So that way, we just wanted to make sure that if a client received these, and it's not specified now, but if it receives them later, that it, just ignores them or is prepared to receive messages that it doesn't know about right now. So, but that's an issue. And if you think there should be a confirm, then let us know. All right, I think that's the last one.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. So yeah, we need to decide how we're going to progress this. Tom, before you sit down, you did say 2 or 3 weeks ago you were kind of hoping to get some more implementation feedback before this went to working group last call. Clearly, 2 or 3 of the discussions there indicate we need to go through those issues as well. So yeah, I guess we need to let this stew is the wrong word.
Stuart has gotten
simmer for a bit.
Stuart has gotten some implementation feedback. I had not, and so I think there's both on the client side and the server side there has been some implementation.
I think the other thing is there are a couple of drafts that are referenced as normative references that are drafts. So I think I've seen an email discussion about the Keep Alive, and I think there's the TLS spec as well that's a draft there. So we need to keep an eye on when those are likely to push through as well. Okay. Yeah, so I think we'll need, going to need an 8, obviously. I think we need to have a discussion about the Keep Alive. There's a couple of other topics as well I've noted down. So Ralph and I will send a summary to the list. So the next topic is the working group last call on the label interop draft. I think Andrew's just going to stand up to this for hopefully not too long and just say what he's received in terms of comments and what his view of where we are is. I think I've seen Dave Taylor, I think, gave some feedback. I don't think I've seen any other, but it would be nice to have some more affirmative comments to progress it.
So I'm Andrew, and no, I didn't have any slides because the only feedback on this was Dave's, so I don't know what to do with it. There is one thing that happened here in the room, so here's a value of everybody coming together, and that was Dave's remark at the mic about automatic handling of these things by intermediate servers. And I think that actually our previous discussion suggested that we shouldn't do that, and that you should do that out at the edge and retry. And maybe your client has a theory about where in the tree you're going to start using UTF-8 as your label as opposed to using A labels and U labels. But apart from that, I think that's already covered, in fact, in that draft. So I don't think there's any new text there. I don't know if anybody has anything at all to say about this draft, or if anybody's even read it. Has anybody read it? Okay. Maybe silence means consent. I don't know.
I think we're at the point where in my mind, I think Ralph and I are both happy with it. I think we've had some positive comments from DNSOP chair or chairs. I think we're going to push it forward unless we hear reasons not to.
Ted Lemon,
Ted.
I came up here because you haven't heard anything from anybody, and the answer is I read the draft. It looked really good. I was impressed, and I hope that it doesn't contain any errors that I missed, but it looked damn good.
Thank you.
Dave Baylor, I'll just confirm for the rest of the room that's not on Jabber that after the discussion where we talked about before that Andrew's mentioning, we had a Jabber discussion between Andrew and me and folks, and Andrew is accurately summarizing the discussion on Jabber, which is the previous conclusion or the previous proposal that said, that I made that says, okay, you probably should go ahead and translate is actually not necessary because of this draft, and you can just say go ahead and fail it. And so it's yes, we talked about that in the Jabber room. In case anybody wasn't watching that, it's okay to say that. So I'm looking at you, Stuart. My comments on the document for anybody that hasn't read my mail is just that I agree that the technical parts of it is good, and it needs some editorial clarifications around what the problem is. And I'm happy to help work on that, because some of those I gave textual suggestions for, and some of them I didn't, and just said, well, we need to find a better way to phrase this. And trying to summarize about what the actual problem is in which component, and the relationship 60-55, which would be nice to find phrasing that's consistent with that. It just talks about multiple ways to model stuff, right? There's code that knows which protocol that you're using and which naming context you're doing it in, and there's code that doesn't, okay? And saying, well, which side of that, and by the way, that distinction could be, the line between that distinction could actually be at different layers, right, depending how you've implemented it. Is it above or below name resolution libraries or whatever? And to phrase it such that it's clear, regardless of which way you've implemented it, which parts are for you and for which of your components. And so I'm happy to work with Andrew on that. But again, I think that's mostly editorial on what the problem is. Not the technical stuff, I think is fine.
So, okay, that sounds positive. So would you be willing to suggest or provide those edits for Andrew? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying I'm willing to work with people because I'm not exactly sure what the right way to phrase it is, but I'm happy to collaborate with Andrew and anybody else that has an opinion on coming up with what the wording is. So.
But those aren't substantial changes. Those are editorial.
That is my current belief, yes, okay. Is that it should be doable with just editorial changes, because it wouldn't affect, say, whether, because right now, even though I think it's currently tailored for informational, if I remember right,
yeah.
But there is some mechanism-y type stuff that's in there. So even if you were to claim compliance to an informational document, it wouldn't affect what you claim compliance to.
It just sounds like that, hopefully, small amount of effort now will help it slide through the ISG process a little bit easier, perhaps. So,
yes,
it's probably worth
that's my hope, and it's certainly my intent is to try to reduce confusion on the person reading it to say, okay, how does this affect my implementation? Right. What? How do I interpret this guidance? I know what my implementation is doing, and what does this mean to me? And help people to translate between those. I think my comments fit into that category.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So it looks like we're going to do a minor update to a 3, just on that.
I mean, definitely they're helpful comments, but if other people have comments, it'd be great to.
It would be good to get them.
I'm certainly not going to work on it this week, so if you sent the comments this week, they'd get in. Thanks.
There's a request you should take up. Okay, so we're a little bit behind. So what Ralph and I propose doing is going to Christian now, have a discussion about his proposal. We'll give him the 10 minutes that we allocated. Then we'll see where we are. We may or may not bring Hosni in. I've emailed her, I haven't had a response, but she's on the Meet Echo, I think. We'll see how it goes anyway. So over to Christian to talk about a proposal for how we might provide a little bit more privacy into the Dnssd mechanism.
So, thank you for the time. I'm Christian.
Clicker there somewhere. Christian.
Oh. Yes. Okay. So I have been working for some time on various aspects of privacy, and the stuff that I've been particularly concerned with is stemming the flow of metadata. And the flow of metadata on various movement on the internet is very large. I mean, that's give an example of flow there. But the basic idea is that whenever we move to new location, we tend to leave lots of breadcrumbs that our device are sending over the network. Now, there have been some progress made, and we have been able to stem some of that flow. I mean, mechanisms like MAC address randomization, for example, will take care of one big part of that, which is leaking your MAC address to each network that you are visiting and to each access point in the way. So that's one way. DHCP parameters are another way of leaking metadata, and we are taking care of that too. DNS traffic is a rich source of metadata because it tells you every site that you are visiting and all the requests that you are making. It can identify you, it can identify your interest. And we are working on that with the DNS privacy working group. And basically, I'm looking at the next one in that series of leaks. And I'm really concerned with what we can do with MDNS and with Dnssd. I mean, we all go to the airport and we look for stuff and we see a list of devices available. I mean, so-and-so's Windows Phone and whatever. And that's not good, okay? We can think that those names are partial names, that there may be several people called Stuart or whatever, but in truth, partial names can be combined, and the combination of partial names give you a fairly strong identification. In the case of Dnssd, the very process of Dnssd is meant to advertise stuff. So it will advertise the services that are available, and because we want this advertisement to be useful in a list picker, the name have to be somewhat expressive. And if they are expressive, they can be used as a source of metadata. The host name, if we use a typical host name, and we had a draft with Dave in the interior about every kind of leak we can do with host names also really reveal a lot of metadata. They are partial identifiers of your device. They are typically used in context, but even out of context, they are partial identifiers. So the general idea is that stop feeding the critters. Stop doing metadata. I had a small discussion on the list of the draft already, and one of the points that was made was, hey, why don't we just use DNS privacy? The problem with that, I mean, it seems logical. I mean, we're looking at privacy of MDNS and DNS service discovery, so why not just use the mechanism built in to do privacy of DNS, or the mechanism we're building? The problem is those mechanisms are not addressing the same problem. Basically, DNS privacy is there to protect the user making the queries. We don't want that anybody knows that you are querying www.youporn.com. But it doesn't do anything for the publisher. If you are publishing that you have a printer here, DNS privacy will not do anything to that. Anybody will be able to query and read the fact that you have a printer and the name of the printer. So if we want to solve the issues that are inherent in pricing Dnssd, we have to basically build some protection in the mechanism itself. Now, in the draft, I proposed a relatively simple solution which is based on obfuscation of names. And that's liberally inspired by what Bluetooth Low Energy is doing with their advertisement process. The basic idea is that instead of advertising a name of the service, I will just advertise a random string. And the random string is constructed as a nonce and a proof. Now, anybody who knows my password for publishing can hash the nonce and verify that it meets the proof, and then it knows it's me or my device. But anybody else who doesn't know about that password cannot find it. Now, that's one way to solve the issue, and we can combine that with some obfuscation of the host name in MDNS. There are certainly other ways. I mean, Tom was suggesting that we just built up a parallel system to Dnssd that would be based on some kind of a private communication channel. I like personally this kind of obfuscation system because the implementation changes that you have to do to your discovery system to do that are very small. It's basically a preprocessor in your list picker that recognizes that and publishes it. So it's very contained, doesn't change any of the protocols. It's pretty good otherwise. And that's why I'd like to have it discussed here. Now, clearly, that draft I did is just a V0. Okay. I know from the beginning that there are at least 3 issues. There's one issue which is inherent to anything based on privacy, which is the key distribution. If you want to have data that is just available to a few people, then you have to basically distribute keys so that only those few people can get it. But maybe we need a mechanism to do that. And the suggestion is maybe we should do something similar to Bluetooth. Or maybe we should restrict the scenario to my phone and my laptop discovering each other, in which case they can synchronize by whatever system way in advance and be discrete. The other problem, which is inherent to the obfuscation approach, is that if people are not in on the game that we are playing, the lead speaker will show list of gobbledygook names, and that's very upsetting. That might be very upsetting for the users. Am I under attack? Am I doing something? Of course, it's also easy if you are in the game to recognize that form and say, oh, not for me, and just not list it. But it requires a change to every listener. And the third one is a DOS attack, which is kind of linked to the mechanism as well. I mean, if you are going to send nonsensical names and expend some computing power to decrypt them, then somebody else can send a bunch of them and force you to expend a lot of power doing the decryption. And frankly, I have no good solution there. But I think it's inherent to the problem anyhow. So basically, that's a problem. I mean, I think that broadcasting I'm here when you're not in a safe place is not a good idea. I think that doing some kind of obfuscation is a nice way to solve the problem. And I would like to get feedback from the group.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. I think it's very important that we do this kind of work in whatever working groups we can. It's been 2.5 years since the Snowden thing and the whole mass pervasive surveillances and attack documents and so on that we've published through the IETF. So it's good to see it here. Obviously, also this applies generally to MDNS and Dnssd. The fact that we're extending that in this working group is obviously means there are obvious implications. So it'd be very good to hear what people think about this, whether we should take this on, and if so, what people's thoughts about the issues that Christian has put forward are. Ted.
Ted Lemon. So, one question that I would have is, do I even, if I'm not connected to a network that I know, do I even want to publish my laptop's name on the network? I mean, I guess the reason why you would want to do that is because you have an end user who doesn't have the mental model of this happening and they still want to be able to do file sharing or something like that. Is that the thought?
Yeah, I mean, clearly one way to be private is to be silent.
Right.
But if you choose to be silent just because you want privacy, it means that you cannot use a scenario.
Right.
So if you need your phone to discover your laptop on the local network, and you choose to remain silent, you just have at the same time chosen that they will remain isolated.
But
I don't like the dilemma.
Well, so there are places that are home, and there are places that are not home, right? And that's
Yes.
that's one thing that you can use to differentiate. So the question is there anything to be gained from using that? For example, maybe the devices introduce each other when they're at home, and then having done that, they can publish names that wouldn't appear in a chooser, but that allow them to see each other and rendezvous, even if they're on some other wire. But only after that.
That's clearly a way to solve the initial rendezvous issues, that to have this initial pairing happen in a safe place. Clearly, yes.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I don't want my device to publish anything publicly when I'm not at home, or at work or something like that. And then the other question is, actually, I forgot what the other question is, so why don't I step aside?
Just briefly, I want to say thanks for doing this work. I think this is useful and it's important. There's clearly a lot to think about. So thank you. I think there's room for some guidance that maybe by default these mobile devices don't need to be advertising services at all. Infrastructure like printers is there to offer a service, and it makes sense to advertise those, and it probably makes sense to advertise it publicly in a lot of cases. For mobile devices, it may not make sense, except for, as you say, the syncing and the file exchange case. There are other problems that get in the way there. It's routine now. I think Alf Watt on the mailing list commented, a lot of mobile hotspots do client isolation. So we can actually, I understand, the acoustics are bad. So clients can't talk peer-to-peer at all, which is an extra twist on this. We may need to look at peer-to-peer Wi-Fi technologies like Wi-Fi Direct and things like that, which doesn't make these, it doesn't solve these problems, it just moves you to a different layer. You're still broadcasting your identity. So yes, I agree that there's work to be done here, and I don't know what the answers are now, but let's hope we find them.
So I think just for a moment before Dan, because I think this is something that it's not currently within our charter as such, but I think it's something that we should be taking on. So we'll speak to our AD about that, and there's a chance, well, at some point we're going to need to re-charter as well, I think, so we'll consider that. Dan?
Dan York, when I was reading the draft, thank you first for doing this kind of work. I can see instances where it could be useful for that. I guess my question was, what has the thought been around the key distribution mechanisms, you know, for Alice and Bob, and for Bob to learn the instance key, the instance discovery key for Alice? What has been the thinking around how they learn the keys?
What I see is that there are a number of ad hoc mechanisms being used by video games, by various things, which are in fact the next level of metadata in my list. And I would very much like to have a safe way to do that using a profile of Dnssd, rather than having a bunch of guys invent their own little ways of doing that when you're playing Halo together or whatever. So that's kind of my thinking there, is that there are a bunch of those, and yes, they tend to be peer-to-peer scenarios, and yes, we could do that on peer-to-peer networks. However, I mean, peer-to-peer networks typically point-to-point, so if you have more than two guys, it's much better to be in infrastructure, etc., etc. So
I was just curious because I think when we've had these kind of discussions around this, that the secure key distribution's always been one of those hard parts that has had different ways. But anyway, thank you for the work on this.
Yeah, I was thinking on some phones when you plug them in, Tom Pusateri, when you plug a phone into a computer, it says, do you want to trust this computer? And then it establishes a relationship or whatever. In the same way, when you join a wireless network, you have to select that wireless network. And when you do that, you're kind of saying the same thing. You're saying, well, I trust this wireless network enough to do it. So I'm not saying that that's the solution, but I'm saying there is a sort of a recognition that you are joining a network, a different network.
That is true. I mean, there are cases where you will be at your home network and you are basically not concerned with people keeping track of you there. But there are also many cases where you are, say, at the airport with a colleague and you have joined the network access point because you want to have connection to the internet, but you also, and you don't particularly trust that network. In fact, you don't trust it at all. But you're also wanting to have some kind of peer-to-peer or whatever service discussion with your buddy who's traveling on the same flight. And so you have an example there of wanting to use the connectivity to do something private in a place that is otherwise not very private.
Okay, thank you very much, Christian. So I've been speaking to Hosni via email. We'll defer the discussion of her draft to the list. There's already, as I speak, there is list discussion happening on that with Andrew. So please do join in that discussion on that draft. So I think it's been very useful. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll just wrap up by just recapping where we are. I am for the hybrid proxy draft. Stuart will be producing a 04. Ralph and I will speak to our AD about whether we need to repeat the last call or not. We've got DNS push, which we're not going to progress to a working group last call yet. There are still clearly some issues to work through there around the keeper lives and also how we handle the DNS updates if those are used alongside this mechanism. So there's other considerations there. The label interop draft, Andrew's draft, Dave and he will work together to produce hopefully minor editorial updates so that we can then progress that without a further working group last call to the ISG. The privacy work, I think we want to take forward, so I'd encourage discussion of that on the list. But it looks like we're getting much closer now to being able to publish hopefully the hybrid proxy and the DNS push and the label interop. Moving forward, I think we're going to be speaking to the ADs. Just had a whispered discussion with Ralph about how we take the group forward beyond that. Once we've got hybrid proxy and DNS push out there, we've got that basis, as Stuart put it, to build other things upon. So I think there are various documents we could then be looking at with a recharter, again, subject to the AD, the discussion with the AD. So there will be operational documents, perhaps on a per scenario basis, or a single document describing how we can use these building blocks in an enterprise or in a home net, etc. There's the privacy work that Christian has started here, which I think is very important. There's discussion in various places of the stitching draft or the merging link local draft, and I think we need to identify what the scope of that document is and what we want to do there. Going back 2 or 3 meetings, there was a presentation, I can't remember the exact name of the guy that did it, Agrawal, I think, produced a very interesting draft on filtering that can be done at different places to add some efficiency. So we might want to revisit that. So there are a number of issues that once you've got the building blocks in place are about how you use this technology to increase its scalability, to make it more efficient. So that's one example of that. We then have the coexistence, if it happens, of DNS update mechanisms with the type of solution we've got here. Obviously, we've had a start of that discussion there. We can take that forward. And then the final thing is what we do with the threats document that Hosni and Doug have been working on. There's that discussion happening now. So we need to be clear on what the purpose of that document is and where we're heading with it, I think. So I think that's where we are. It's Ralph nodding. Okay. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Are there any other, in the last couple of minutes, are there any other comments or anything anyone wants to say? Or we can actually finish on time, if not. Take silence as a desire to go and get the cookies. And thank you to our note takers and our JavaScribe relays. We can't do it without you. Thank you. So please take those discussions to the list, and we'll see you in Berlin. Blue sheets. Oh yes, blue sheets. And sorry if the chairs were a little bit confused at times. The acoustics in here, as Christian could see as well, are quite horrible. So we'll relay that to the operational guys. Cheers, Stuart. It's quite hard hearing. It's weird. Back. Here, please.
No, I have to do that to somebody since I just feel like Cisco and I have three guys that have been with this true relationship. Right.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.